truth was just beginning.
March 1944. The rain had turned the roads of northern France into rivers of mud. A column of German infantry trudged east, rifles slung low, boots caked with brown sludge. The war had changed. They could feel it, though no one dared to say it aloud. The sky above was a dull sheet of gray, heavy with smoke and the faint echo of distant artillery. Then it came. That sound. A shrill metallic whistle that began as a whisper and swelled into a scream. Heads snapped upward. The younger soldiers froze. The veterans dropped to their knees before thought could catch up. The whistle turned into a roar, the unmistakable thunder of a diving P-47. In the next heartbeat, the earth convulsed. Dust, metal, and human voices collided in the air. The column scattered, rifles forgotten in the mud. For a moment, there was silence again. Only the smell of cordite and the slow settling of ash. Somewhere in the distance, the Thunderbolt climbed back into the clouds. Unseen, invincible, its echo lingering longer than its shadow. That sound, that whistle, would come to define March 1944. The month when the Luftwaffe could no longer rule the air, and German infantry learned to fear the sky itself.
In Deckung! Alarm! Es kommt! Runter!
By early 1944, the balance of the air war in Europe had shifted irrevocably. For nearly 4 years, German aircraft had prowled the skies over Europe with ruthless confidence. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 had once been the undisputed predators, guarding the Reich's cities and front lines with precision and pride. But by March, that supremacy was collapsing. Allied factories across Britain and America were producing fighters and bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and the relentless bombing of industrial centers had reduced Germany's air force to a shadow of its former self. The U.S. 8th Air Force, flying out of England, had matured into a striking arm of industrial-scale destruction. Its daylight bombing raids no longer feared the flak corridors over Germany, for now they had an escort, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Known affectionately by its pilots as the Jug, the P-47 was a brute of metal and horsepower. Its radial engine could soak up damage and still bring the pilot home. It carried 8 50 caliber machine guns and enough bombs and rockets to tear apart columns, trains, or entire airfields. What it lacked in elegance, it made up for in invincibility. The Allied command had learned a brutal truth. To win the war on the ground, they had to first destroy the enemy in the sky. Operation Point Blank, the Allied air campaign aimed at crippling German aircraft production, was in full motion. The goal was clear: crush the Luftwaffe before the planned invasion of France. Every day, waves of bombers streamed toward targets like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Leipzig, escorted by Thunderbolts that roamed far beyond the range once thought possible.
The German response was desperate. The Luftwaffe scrambled fighters from battered airfields, often piloted by young, barely trained men. Many had less than 20 flight hours in combat aircraft. They were met by hardened American squadrons flying in disciplined formations, communicating by radio and guided by radar from across the Channel. The old German edge, agility, experience, and tactical daring was no longer enough. Now the air belonged to whoever had more fuel, more planes, and more pilots who could live to fight again tomorrow. Below that shifting front in the sky, German infantry began to feel the consequences. Supply lines that had once moved freely by day were now confined to the night. Convoys hugged tree lines. Trucks were camouflaged under nets and soldiers dug their trenches deeper. The hum of an approaching aircraft, even when it was friendly, made men flinch. The once proud Wehrmacht, forged in the doctrine of blitzkrieg, was beginning to crawl. By March 1944, the P-47s were operating not just as escorts but as hunters. Their pilots patrolled over occupied France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, attacking anything that moved: trains, columns, fuel depots, or even solitary motorcycles. The roar of the Thunderbolt was more than sound. It was a warning. German officers wrote in their diaries of entire battalions pinned down by a single flight of Allied fighters. The front lines had expanded vertically. Now soldiers fought not only across fields and forests but against the very sky above them. The weather of that month was cruel and damp, with thick overcast days that broke into sudden clearings. These openings were the moments pilots waited for, when shafts of sunlight would slice through the gray, revealing movement below. That was when the Thunderbolt struck. Villages, crossroads, and bridges became firestorms in seconds. The Germans nicknamed the aircraft Jabos, short for Jagdbombern, or fighter bombers, and cursed them with a mix of hatred and awe. Each strike further weakened German morale. Each burning convoy reminded soldiers that help from the Luftwaffe was no longer coming. The Reich's once invincible war machine was being dismantled piece by piece, from the clouds down to the trenches. The whistle that terrified those marching men in France was not just the sound of an aircraft. It was the voice of a new kind of warfare, one that would define the last desperate year of the Third Reich. And behind that voice was the machine that made it possible: the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt.
Achtung, Tiefflieger! Weg hier, schnell!
The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born out of necessity and desperation. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its Army Air Forces were still evolving from a peacetime mindset. Fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and the early P-38 Lightning were capable but lacked the endurance to escort bombers deep into German territory. The Thunderbolt changed that equation. Designed by Georgian-born engineer Alexander Kartveli, it was unlike anything that had flown before: huge, heavy, and unapologetically powerful. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a massive 18-cylinder radial that produced over 2,000 horsepower.
The jug is hit hard. With controls failing, the pilot makes the desperate decision to abandon ship.
There's his chute. He made it.
To control the heat generated by that beast, Kartveli's team added a unique turbo supercharger system that gave the P-47 exceptional performance at high altitude. The result was an aircraft that could climb like a rocket and dive faster than most German interceptors dared to follow. It wasn't graceful, but it was unstoppable. Early versions of the Thunderbolt began arriving in Europe in 1943, first as bomber escorts for the 8th Air Force. At that stage, the American daylight bombing strategy was bleeding men and machines. Unescorted B-17 and B-24s suffered catastrophic losses to the Luftwaffe's swarming fighters. The Thunderbolt's introduction began to change that. Though its range was initially limited, the installation of drop tanks extended its endurance, allowing it to accompany bombers deep into German airspace. For the first time, the daylight bomber crews had protection and confidence. But as 1943 turned into 1944, the Thunderbolt's role evolved. Newer, longer-range P-51 Mustangs began to take over high-altitude escort duties, freeing the P-47 for a task it was uniquely suited to: low-level ground attack. The Thunderbolt's rugged frame could absorb staggering punishment, flak bursts, small arms fire, even direct hits to its wings, and still bring pilots home. Its 8 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute, shredded convoys, tanks, and troop concentrations with horrifying precision. Equipped with 500-pound bombs and later high-velocity rockets, the P-47 became the scourge of German ground forces. In preparation for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, entire squadrons of Thunderbolts were reassigned to the newly formed 9th Air Force and its 9th Tactical Air Command. Their mission was clear: cripple German mobility in occupied France before the first Allied soldier set foot on the beaches. Bridges, rail yards, truck convoys, and ammunition dumps became priority targets.
Flieger! Schnell! In Deckung! Los, beeilt euch! Runter hier!
Each mission brought pilots lower and closer to danger, often within range of machine guns and light flak batteries hidden in villages and tree lines. German reports from this period paint a picture of near-constant torment. Supply columns could no longer move in daylight. Even stationary units risked being spotted from the air and obliterated in minutes. The sound of an aircraft engine triggered panic reflexes, men diving for cover, officers shouting to camouflage vehicles, horses bolting in terror. A single P-47 could hold up an entire battalion's advance simply by circling overhead. American pilots, meanwhile, spoke of the strange exhilaration and dread of low-level attack runs. They saw the flashes of their own guns reflecting off the canopies, the black puffs of flak bursting around them, the streaks of tracer fire racing upward. Many admitted they could smell burning fuel and flesh from hundreds of feet away. It was warfare stripped of distance, personal, immediate, and merciless. By March 1944, hundreds of Thunderbolts operated daily across Western Europe, from bases in England to newly captured airstrips along the Channel coast. Their sorties blurred the line between strategic and tactical warfare. They weren't just destroying targets, they were dismantling the German army's ability to function at all. The roads of France and Belgium became graveyards of trucks, tanks, and wagons. Allied intelligence reported that some German divisions were losing up to 30% of their transport capacity every week. The Luftwaffe tried to resist. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts rose to challenge the jugs, but the outcome was increasingly one-sided. The German fighters were outnumbered, their pilots exhausted, their fuel scarce.
We move according to plan at dawn, regardless of the resistance.
Jawohl, Herr Major. The roads must be secured.
Each Thunderbolt that returned to base meant another sortie tomorrow. Each German loss meant another empty hangar. The skies were shifting toward Allied dominance, and everyone on the ground could feel it. It was in this crucible, between collapsing Luftwaffe defenses and an increasingly desperate German army, that the legend of the Thunderbolt's whistle was born. That haunting sound, rising out of the gray clouds over France, came to symbolize a new kind of power, the total supremacy of air over ground. And it is through that power, that human fear, and that mechanical precision that the next part of our story unfolds. Through the eyes of those who lived beneath the Thunderbolt's shadow. The men on the ground never forgot that sound. German infantrymen who had survived the Eastern Front, who had faced tanks, artillery, and the unending cold, wrote later that nothing unnerved them quite like the scream of a diving thunderbolt. It was not only the destruction it caused, it was the helplessness it imposed. In battle, a man could shoot back, maneuver, or retreat. Against the Thunderbolt, there was nothing to do but dive into the earth and pray the bombs fell elsewhere. The pilots knew it too. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney engine produced a low, powerful rumble at cruise. But when the aircraft dove, often at over 400 miles per hour, the air rushing past its airframe created a high-pitched whistle, a haunting cry that echoed across the countryside. It became part of the aircraft's legend, amplified by stories passed among frightened soldiers. German officers warned their troops to remain calm under air attack, but even seasoned veterans admitted that discipline broke down when the Jabos arrived.
This is the primary target here, just south of the bridge.
All right, spread out after the initial run.
Trucks were abandoned mid-road, guns were left unmanned, men scattered in every direction. For the Allied pilots, the mission was relentless. They flew 2, sometimes 3 sorties a day. Each flight meant low altitude, small targets, and lethal flak. A single well-placed 20mm shell could rip through a Thunderbolt's wing or cockpit, yet the pilots kept going. They developed their own rituals, checking photos of loved ones before takeoff, tapping the cockpit frame for luck. They named their aircraft with bold, defiant slogans: Big Ass Bird 2, Little Bunny, Razorback Express. These painted names and grinning shark mouths were a reminder that beneath the metal and fuel, human courage still powered the war machine. On the ground, soldiers learned to read the sky. The P-47 had a distinct silhouette, broad wings, a round nose, and a thick fuselage. Even before its whistle, Its shadow was enough to send men diving. German units began to camouflage their positions more creatively. Dummy vehicles made from wood and canvas, decoy fires to mislead strafing runs. But the pilots adapted just as quickly. They learned to identify tracks, movement, and the telltale shine of metal beneath foliage. No amount of camouflage could hide the smell of fuel or the glint of a convoy seen from 3,000 feet.
Target acquired. Move left now.
For the villagers of occupied France, the Thunderbolt was both terror and hope. The attacks brought death, but they also signaled the coming liberation. Many civilians risked their lives to pass information to Allied intelligence, marking targets, sketching airfields, or noting train movements. Farmers in the countryside would wave from their fields as P-47s roared overhead, even as bombs fell a few miles away. In towns reduced to rubble, people learned to distinguish the deep growl of German bombers from the sharper, higher tone of the American engines.
All right, let's go. Push forward.
The whistle, to them, meant that the tide of war was turning. Tactically, the Thunderbolt became the backbone of the Allied push toward Normandy. Pilots trained in what was called cab rank support, flying in circles above battle zones, waiting for ground units to radio coordinates. The cooperation between air and ground forces reached a level of precision unseen before in modern warfare. Infantry units advancing through hedgerows could call down P-47s to strike enemy tanks or machine gun nests minutes after spotting them. The sky had become an extension of the battlefield, fast, coordinated, and deadly, and the Germans, who once used air power to paralyze their enemies in 1940, now faced their own mirror image. The Blitzkrieg, built upon the shock of Stuka dive bombers, was being rewritten from above by American pilots in Thunderbolts. The whistle that once belonged to the Stuka's siren now belonged to the enemy. The hunted had become the hunted again. By late March, the ground commanders reported a strange phenomenon. German soldiers were surrendering faster when Thunderbolts were overhead. Some units raised white cloths or laid down their weapons at the mere sight of circling aircraft. The whistle had transcended sound. It had become psychological warfare. It reminded every soldier below that no movement went unseen, no escape route was safe, and that the Reich's power to strike back was dying with every mission flown. Each flight was a piece of that unraveling, the steady erosion of an army's will. The pilots above and the soldiers below were bound by the same fate, drawn together by sound, smoke, and fear. And that fear, both given and received, shaped the outcome of the war far beyond what any bullet could accomplish. As the Thunderbolts continued their patrols across France, another war was being fought, not in the trenches or the towns, but in the minds of men, where the noise of engines and the silence after each attack carried equal weight. Every weapon tells a story of the minds that built it, and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was no exception. Its very design spoke of American industrial might, the ability to pour raw aluminum, steel, and oil into a single instrument of overwhelming force. By 1944, the U.S. had perfected not only the art of mass production but the science of continuous improvement. The Thunderbolt's design evolved almost monthly. New propellers, stronger wing pylons, rocket racks, and reinforced canopies transformed it from a high-altitude escort into a ground-attack Leviathan. Behind this transformation stood leadership that understood the future of warfare. General Karl Spaatz and Air Marshal Arthur Tedder envisioned air power not as support but as domination, a means to render the enemy's armies irrelevant before battle even began. Under their strategy, aircraft like the Thunderbolt became tools of paralysis, freezing enemy movements long before tanks or infantry made contact. The 9th Air Force was their instrument, and by early 1944, it was executing a level of coordination between air and ground never before seen. Technology gave that vision its wings. The Thunderbolt carried a K-14 computing gun sight that calculated lead on moving targets, enabling pilots to hit vehicles or trains with mathematical precision. Its armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks meant survivability was as vital as lethality. Even when riddled with shrapnel, the Jug could limp home, trailing smoke, its pilot alive. In a war where every sortie risked death, That resilience bred confidence, and confidence bred aggression. Pilots dared to fly lower, dive steeper, and attack harder, knowing their machines could take the punishment. On the other side, German technology was faltering. The Luftwaffe still fielded superb aircraft. The FW-190F and the Ju-87G were formidable ground attack platforms, but their numbers dwindled. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Factories bombed by Allied raids could no longer replace losses. Even the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter, though in development, remained too few and too late. By March 1944, German command had accepted a grim truth. The war in the air was lost, and without air cover, every movement on the ground was an invitation to destruction. This imbalance introduced moral questions that would echo long after the war. Photographs from the time show convoys obliterated on French roads, the bodies of men and horses scattered among smoking vehicles. The pilots who caused that devastation wrote of the strange duality of their mission, the exhilaration of victory, and the unease that followed when the adrenaline faded. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of the leading American aces, once admitted that looking down at the wreckage left behind, "You realize there were men in those trucks, and then you flew another mission the next day." Air power had made killing impersonal, yet strangely intimate. The Thunderbolt's pilots saw their targets up close, faces, gestures, uniforms, before they vanished in fire. Unlike high-altitude bombers, they could not hide behind distance. They saw what they destroyed. That proximity changed many who flew the Jug. Some later described feeling detached, others haunted. The sky had given them power that was godlike and terrifying in equal measure. Leadership recognized that burden. Commanders introduced rotation systems and enforced rest periods for pilots suffering combat fatigue. They also emphasized precision, target verification, avoidance of civilian areas, and coordination with advancing Allied troops. But in the fog of war, perfection was impossible. Villages suspected of harboring German fuel depots were flattened. Rail lines were bombed even when packed with refugee trains. The Thunderbolt's roar became, for many civilians, the sound of both salvation and suffering. And yet, in the brutal calculus of total war, the results were undeniable. The German army's ability to maneuver collapsed. The Eastern Front absorbed most of its remaining reserves, leaving the Western divisions stranded, underfed, and demoralized. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy 3 months later, the Luftwaffe could muster barely a fraction of its former strength. The roads behind the beaches were littered with the evidence: burned trucks, shattered bridges, cratered crossroads, all silent testimony to the Thunderbolt's reign. The ethics of that dominance would be debated for decades, but in 1944 there was no question among the Allies. The P-47 had become an indispensable weapon of liberation. It was the muscle behind the grand strategy, the hammer that broke the Reich's logistics, and the warning that modern war would never again be fought only on the ground. And as spring deepened into April, that dominance reached its breaking point, when the Thunderbolt's whistle was no longer just feared but fatal, marking a moment when the sky itself decided the outcome of the war. March 23, 1944. The morning began like any other in occupied northern France. Gray clouds, cold wind, and the uneasy quiet that came before the day's convoys started to move. A German supply column, nearly 200 vehicles long, wound its way through the rolling countryside near Saint-Lô. Trucks loaded with ammunition, food, and fuel crept forward along narrow rural roads. Horses strained against wagons, and soldiers walked alongside, rifles slung across their backs. They had learned to fear clear skies, but the overcast above seemed thick and safe. It would not stay that way. At 0940 hours, a hole opened in the clouds, a bright shaft of sunlight that spilled across the fields. To the men below, it was a moment of calm. To the pilots above, it was an invitation. 6 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts from the 404th Fighter Group had been patrolling at 10,000 feet, scanning the patchwork below through gaps in the weather. Lieutenant Edward Lynch was the flight leader. His voice came crackling through the radio. "Column at 2 o'clock. Long. Moving slow. Let's go to work." The formation peeled away in unison, engines howling as they dropped into a dive. The air screamed past their wings, turning that deep rumble into the high, piercing whistle that German soldiers dreaded. Down below, someone shouted, a warning lost in the chaos of engines and boots. The first bombs struck the head of the column, erupting in a sheet of orange fire that consumed trucks and men alike. The concussion rolled down the road, toppling wagons and sending horses bolting into the fields. Within seconds, the second wave arrived, guns blazing, ripping through canvas and metal. A German officer, Oberleutnant Hans Reiser, later wrote in his diary that it felt as though the sky had opened and poured fire upon us. He described seeing men throw themselves into ditches, trying to burrow into the earth as machine gun rounds tore the ground around them. The Thunderbolts came again and again, working methodically. One passed to strafe, another to drop fragmentation bombs, another to finish what was left burning. In less than 15 minutes, the entire road became an inferno. One of the pilots, Lieutenant Bill Tex Overton, would later recall the scene with quiet detachment. It was like watching ants scatter when you pour water on a hill, he said. We didn't think of it as killing. It was just the job. Hit the lead, hit the tail, and keep them boxed in. From his canopy, he could see trucks bursting one after another, ammunition cooking off like fireworks. When he pulled out of his dive, the shockwave rattled his cockpit. Below, nothing moved. The attack was not without cost. A burst of 20mm flak from a hidden gun emplacement ripped into the wing of one Thunderbolt. The pilot, Lieutenant George Keller, struggled to maintain control as smoke filled his cockpit. He bailed out at 500 feet, his parachute barely opening before he hit the ground. German soldiers captured him minutes later. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner, one of the few survivors from that column who would see the end. By the time the Thunderbolts climbed back into the clouds, the road below was unrecognizable. Trucks burned in twisted heaps, horses lay dead in their traces. The fields were littered with equipment, weapons, and the bodies of men who had never even seen their attackers. Smoke rose in black columns visible for miles, marking the spot where the Luftwaffe could not come. The destruction was total, but the psychological shock was even greater. Nearby units refused to move for hours afterward, fearing another attack. Reports sent to German headquarters described panic and paralysis spreading among supply formations. Commanders ordered night movements only, but even under darkness, fear lingered. The whistle of the Thunderbolt haunted men in their sleep. It was no longer merely a weapon. It had become a presence. For the Allies, that single mission was routine, one of hundreds flown that month, but its impact rippled far beyond the smoldering wreckage. It proved what many already suspected, that the German army's arteries could be severed not by tanks or artillery, but by precision from above. Roads could be turned into traps, convoys into funerals. The sky had become the battlefield's true front line. As the Thunderbolts returned to base, streaked with soot and oil, the radio chatter was brief and professional. Coordinates logged, fuel levels checked, damage reported. No celebration, no boast, only quiet efficiency. They were soldiers of the air, fighting an invisible war over a land that was beginning to awaken from occupation. That day near St. Lo would become one of many in a pattern of destruction. But it marked a turning point, a moment when the German army stopped looking outward for victory and began looking upward in fear. And as the sun set over the smoldering French countryside, the whistle of the Thunderbolt still echoed in the minds of those who had lived to hear it. The aftermath of the St. Lo strike reverberated far beyond the smoking road. Within hours, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the ruins, and Allied intelligence analyzed the images. One more proof that the German logistical web was breaking apart. Similar reports flowed in from across northern France and Belgium. Convoys destroyed, trains derailed, bridges collapsed. The pattern was unmistakable. The Thunderbolts, once guardians of bombers, had become the cutting edge of a new strategy, systematic annihilation of the enemy's mobility. In the following days, the weather cleared, and the 9th Air Force unleashed its full strength. Across the Channel, at airfields like Chalgrove, Thruxton, and Middle Wallop, hundreds of P-47s thundered into the sky before dawn. Ground crews worked through the night, loading bombs, checking gun belts, painting kill marks on cowls. Each pilot carried a slip of paper with coordinates scribbled in pencil. Depots, junctions, and fuel trucks marked by aerial scouts. They launched in tight formations, sunlight glinting off canopies, their engines shaking the earth as they climbed. Below, the German army tried to adapt. Camouflage nets stretched over roads, trucks painted in earthy tones, dummy vehicles placed to draw attacks. Yet the deception failed. The Thunderbolts were no longer searching aimlessly. They were guided by intelligence gathered from the French resistance and Allied reconnaissance. Messages passed through underground networks, shortwave transmissions, coded letters, even marks carved discreetly on barn doors. The enemy's concealment had nowhere to hide. March 25, 1944, 2 days after Saint-Lô, another convoy was struck near Amiens. This time, the assault was coordinated with astonishing precision. While one flight attacked the main road, another cut off the escape routes, strafing bridges and intersections. German flak crews fired desperately, black puffs dotting the sky, but the Thunderbolts came in low, too low for heavy guns to track. Their machine guns stitched the road from end to end, tearing apart fuel drums and ammunition trucks. The explosions came one after another, until the entire valley burned. When smoke cleared, Allied observers counted nearly 150 destroyed vehicles. It was during these operations that the Luftwaffe's impotence became painfully clear. Radar stations detected the Allied raids, but few interceptors rose to meet them. Every available German fighter was being pulled eastward to face the Red Army's relentless advance. Those left in the west flew with rationed fuel and inexperienced pilots. On March 27th, a group of Focke-Wulf 190s scrambled from an airfield near Chartres to intercept a Thunderbolt formation. Only 3 reached altitude. One was shot down within minutes. Another fled with a smoking engine. The third vanished into cloud. German radio chatter that day was filled with despair. "We cannot protect our soldiers. The sky belongs to them now." On the ground, morale collapsed further. Infantry divisions began abandoning motor transport entirely, reverting to horses and bicycles to avoid detection. Orders shifted to nighttime marches only. During daylight, men huddled in barns or dugouts, listening for the distant drone that could spell death. Civilians described entire towns falling silent when the noise of aircraft approached. Farmers dropping tools, children hiding under beds, even animals growing restless. The sound of the Thunderbolt had become synonymous with doom. Among Allied ranks, however, confidence surged. Pilots spoke of the March miracle, the period when sorties doubled, losses fell, and results skyrocketed. Commanders could now plan ground operations knowing that any German reinforcements would be shredded long before they arrived. In one instance, a P-47 squadron destroyed an entire armored column intended to counter a partisan uprising. Another decimated a train carrying fuel to the Pas-de-Calais defenses. Every mission brought the Allies closer to their true goal, softening the Atlantic Wall for the invasion that loomed only weeks away. One British observer later described watching a Thunderbolt attack from a hillside near Caen. It was as if the air itself had turned against the Germans. The sound was unbearable. The scream, the roar, the crash. And then only the wind afterward, carrying the smell of burnt oil and soil. That sound, once strange and mechanical, had become the music of Allied dominance. By the final days of March 1944, German field commanders were filing reports of acute air paralysis. They begged for air cover, for reinforcements, for mercy. None came. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, had become a memory. Grounded, shattered, and starved of fuel. Its few remaining pilots were told to conserve energy for decisive defense. But those words had lost meaning. The sky was lost. And yet, amid the collapse, there remained a grim clarity. German officers understood that their armies were now fighting blind and exposed, while Allied soldiers marched forward with the constant guardian overhead. The Thunderbolt's whistle, that shrill descending cry, had become more than just sound. It was prophecy. It announced the coming storm that would soon sweep across the beaches of Normandy. The sky, once a battlefield shared, was now a single-sided war. And in that silence of enemy resistance, the roar of Allied power echoed louder than ever. That silence marked not the end of battle, but the beginning of a new phase, the reckoning that followed when destruction on this scale reshaped everything beneath it. By early April 1944, the northern French countryside no longer resembled a landscape of farms and towns. It had become a graveyard of twisted steel and scorched roads. The trees were blackened, the hedgerows splintered, and the faint smell of burnt rubber clung to the air like smoke that refused to fade. Locals began calling it Le Désert de Fer, the Iron Desert. In the villages that still stood, survivors spoke in low voices about the planes. They no longer needed to describe them. Everyone knew what the Thunderbolt looked like. Broad wings, a squat fuselage, the sound of an engine that rattled the windows before it appeared. Children would draw them in chalk on broken walls, their crude sketches surrounded by tiny dots that represented bombs. The war had left an imprint even in the imagination of those who had nothing left. German soldiers moved differently now, no longer marching in straight lines, no longer trusting daylight. They learned to hide. Columns were broken into small clusters that moved at night, halting at the faintest hum of an engine. They wore leaves on their helmets and smeared their vehicles with mud. Orders were whispered, and maps were read by candlelight inside barns. But it changed nothing. The Thunderbolts flew low and fast, guided by signals from the resistance, who risked their lives to report the faintest sound of engines on French roads. Sometimes, when the Allies struck accurately, a local farmer would find a note dropped from a plane, a simple line, "Merci pour les nouvelles." Thank you for the news. The destruction was not random. Allied command had learned that chaos, if applied methodically, could paralyze an empire. Each rail line destroyed delayed food, fuel, and ammunition bound for the front. Each burned truck meant an hour lost in battle somewhere else. The Thunderbolts' war was one of attrition, death by 1,000 cuts, and the results were visible even in Berlin. Reports arriving at the Reich Air Ministry painted a picture of total collapse. Supply trains could no longer move freely west of the Seine. Repair crews worked around the clock, only to see their work erased within days. One frustrated general called it a war against the horizon. We can no longer reach the front before the sky finds us. But behind every shattered convoy and cratered field lay the unseen cost. Dozens of Allied pilots never returned. The P-47 was powerful, but it was not invincible. Flak batteries, even desperate and undersupplied, could tear through aluminum skin with a single lucky burst. Many Thunderbolts were lost in flames, their pilots buried in unmarked fields or taken prisoner in silence. Villagers sometimes found the wreckage and buried the dead themselves, planting wildflowers over the graves. They did not know their names, only that the men had come from far away to fight a war that was swallowing their world whole. Still, morale in the Allied camps soared. Newspapers in London and New York printed photographs of the Thunderbolts lined up on muddy airfields, their fuselages marked with dozens of mission symbols, small bombs, swastikas, or lightning bolts. Headlines declared, "The Jug that broke the Wehrmacht." The pilots were celebrated like knights of the air, though most of them were barely in their 20s. When interviewed, they spoke modestly. "We just hit what they tell us," one pilot said. "It's the boys on the ground who have to take it from there." What no one could yet grasp was that this campaign, this systematic annihilation of German transport and morale, was not an end, but a preparation. Every burned bridge, every derailed train, every destroyed fuel depot was a brick removed from the foundation of Fortress Europe. When the Allies finally landed on the beaches of Normandy 2 months later, the German army waiting for them was crippled, hungry, disoriented, and unable to move reinforcements fast enough to respond. In the ruins of St. Lo, where it had all begun, the signs of the first strike were still visible. The road remained littered with rusting trucks, their frames melted into the earth. The farmers who returned to the area found shell casings buried deep in the soil. For years afterward, children would dig them up and use them as toys, unaware that those fragments had once changed the course of history. For the French villagers, the Thunderbolts were remembered with both gratitude and fear. They brought liberation, but also ruin. They ended the occupation, but at the cost of everything familiar. "We loved the sound," one survivor said decades later, "but we also hated it. Because we knew what would come after." By spring, the Thunderbolt had become more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of inevitability. Its roar was the sound of a world being remade, one explosion at a time. The roads of France would heal, the fields would grow again, but the echo of that whistle would never truly fade. Because every liberation, in war, leaves a shadow behind. By the end of March 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just another aircraft in the Allied inventory. It had become a psychological weapon. Its deep, rolling thunder was enough to make German columns scatter before a single bullet was fired. Soldiers along the Western Front began to joke grimly that the best way to survive was to listen to the wind. When it began to whistle, you disappeared. Historians would later call this the age of total air supremacy, when the battlefield ceased to exist only on the ground. The Thunderbolt was not built to win dogfights, though it could. It was built to dominate time and space, to dictate when and where the enemy could move, to choke the arteries of an army that once marched across continents. The German generals, once masters of speed, now found their forces trapped in a slow, grinding paralysis. Blitzkrieg had met its opposite, a storm that hunted from above. After the war, reports from Wehrmacht archives revealed the scale of the devastation. In the months before D-Day, P-47s and other fighter bombers destroyed more than 86,000 vehicles, 6,000 locomotives, and over 9,000 rail cars. Hundreds of bridges were rendered unusable. Some entire divisions were delayed for days because of one bombed crossing. The Americans own the sky, one captured officer confessed in April. We move only by night, and even then the moon is their ally. The Thunderbolt's dominance also reshaped Allied strategy. Commanders realized that air power could replace entire divisions of men. Each sortie by a flight of jugs saved lives on the ground. Allied infantry advanced behind a wall of smoke and destruction that cleared the path ahead. When Eisenhower briefed his officers for the Normandy invasion, he emphasized that victory depended on one thing. Control of the air means victory. By then, control of the air belonged to the Thunderbolt and those who flew it. But every victory came at a cost written not only in steel and smoke, but in the memories of those who witnessed it. In post-war France, thousands of civilians spoke of the day when the sky roared and the fields burned. For them, the sound of a P-47 was both terror and salvation. One farmer from Normandy recalled years later, "We ran to the cellar when we heard them. And then we prayed. When the noise stopped, we went outside, and the Germans were gone." The legacy of the Thunderbolt extended far beyond 1944. It taught military planners that future wars would be won not only by armies, but by control of the heavens. Its descendants, the F-84, F-100, and the modern A-10 Thunderbolt II, carried the same spirit, built to endure, to strike hard, to defend those below. Even today, the A-10's cannon fire echoes something ancient, the same terrifying, liberating thunder that rolled over Europe in 1944. For the men who flew the P-47s, the war never left them completely. Many returned home with the ringing of engines still in their ears, their minds haunted by the images of roads on fire and convoys disappearing into dust. Some found peace in the belief that their destruction had saved countless lives. Others spoke little, knowing that history often hides the weight of those who carried its burden. By the summer of 1944, when Allied troops broke through at Saint-Lô and began their march toward Paris, the German infantry no longer fought to win. They fought to survive. The thunder that once filled their ears had become a prophecy fulfilled. The empire that once promised 1,000 years was now measured in days. And so the story of March 1944 ends not in triumphal music, but in a silence that followed the storm. The silence of a continent realizing that the skies had decided its fate. The men who heard the whistle of the Thunderbolt never forgot it. It was the sound of inevitability, of power beyond reach, of history itself descending from above. Because in that month, on those muddy French roads, the thunder did not just mark destruction, it marked the beginning of the end. The whistle of the Thunderbolt was more than a sound of war. It was the sound of a century turning, of empires collapsing under the weight of industry, courage, and innovation. In March 1944, when German infantry dropped their rifles and dove for cover, they were not simply surrendering to a machine. They were surrendering to an idea that war had changed forever. The P-47 Thunderbolt embodied that transformation. It was not graceful like the Spitfire, nor sleek like the Mustang. It was heavy, unromantic, almost crude. But it represented something deeply human: endurance. It could take punishment, deliver power, and return home when logic said it should not. It was the spirit of an age that had learned how to outlast the storm rather than avoid it. When historians speak of strategy and numbers, they often forget the smaller truths. The German soldier who threw down his rifle as the sky roared was not thinking of maps or fronts. He was thinking of survival, of the wife he might never see again, of the cold earth under his fingers, of the hopelessness that came when the horizon itself began to burn. The Thunderbolt brought that realization, that no fortress, no ideology, no army was safe once the sky had turned against it. In that sense, the Thunderbolt was not just an aircraft. It was a mirror held up to humanity. It showed both the heights of technological mastery and the depths of destruction we were capable of reaching. It marked the moment when man learned to control the very element that had once symbolized freedom, the air, and turned it into a weapon. Decades later, the veterans who had lived through that march remembered the silence that followed the attacks more vividly than the noise. The world seemed to hold its breath after each raid, as if unsure whether to mourn or to celebrate. Because every act of liberation carries its own shadow, the price of victory written in smoke and soil. The Thunderbolt's whistle has long faded, but its echo remains in every aircraft that guards the skies today. It is a reminder that power, once unleashed, reshapes not only battles, but the human heart, and that in the thunder's long, rolling echo, we can still hear the sound of a world learning, painfully, how to end its own wars.